Cutting coves on the table saw is a time-tested method for getting perfectly concave cuts off the saw. But, have you ever cut one with a biscuit joiner? This is probably the most dangerous jig I ever made. This was for a very specific project in a very specific moment, and all it is a tiny little cradle to cut a tiny little cove on a project. And now the time has come to redevelop this jig for a new application. So I want to take you through the how and why of the origins of this particular jig, and then take you through the new iteration so that if it's something that might be useful to employ in your own practice, you can do so. So let's dive into it. So, let me tell you how this thing came about very briefly. But also, let's be real, if you've been watching me for a while, you know I struggle to keep things brief, but I will do my best. Here's what happened. It was the fall of 2022, and I was up at the Center for Furniture Craftsmanship doing a fellowship up there, and I was developing a cabinet for a client. Cylindrical cabinet that is coopered together, made of double tapered bent laminations, which turned into staves, which then needed to be cove cut in order to create the light effect that I wanted. This kind of cascading shadows and lights, these highs and lows. And I knew that I couldn't use the table saw for two reasons. Number one, because the circumference of the table saw blade wouldn't have allowed me to get the proper depth of cut that I needed for that cove, but also, and more specifically, those laminations have an arc along their length. And if I were to take those to the table saw, the points at which they touch the saw would create an uneven arc over the length of the staves, and I couldn't have that, now could I? So I had to develop a jig that did two things. Number one, gave me a smaller blade, and number two, gave me a smaller surface along which I could drive those staves. So I developed this jig to hold a biscuit joiner, froze on the word there for a moment, to hold a biscuit joiner at the height that I wanted. And I have a sample here of exactly what I was attempting to do. Let's see if we can get this to focus real quick. I've got these staves. They have these cove cuts in there, and these staves are all arced along their length. So if I were to drive this over a table saw, that cove cut would change over the length of the stave, and we can't have that. So this is where this came from. Now here's my current predicament. I am about to teach a class down in Texas very soon where we are using this cabinet that I made as the base template for a new cabinet. It's gonna be wall hanging, it's gonna be a whiskey cabinet, it will be different, but I do want to give the option to potentially cove the staves of this cabinet to the students. So we need to do two things. We need to remake this jig so that it's safer insofar as we can. And number two, we need to remake this jig so that it fits the DeWalt, because I made this jig to fit the lamello that I had available to me at the Center for Furniture Craftsmanship. But the lamello and the DeWalt have different dimensions, different mechanisms, and so this is not useful for this particular machine. So let's figure out how to do that. That's a bummer. You see, what I was attempting to do was to just countersink this enough where these would pop in there and allow me to attach this plate to this plate. But what happened is that wall got so thin that they just ended up blowing right through. And that's no bueno. So here's what I'm going to do. Because I am lazy and don't want to make an entire new one, which we've talked about in the past, I take the path of least resistance. I'm going to take a bigger washer and I'm going to countersink a bigger hole. Now, the reason I bring this up is not to encourage you to do sloppy work, but to acknowledge that everybody makes mistakes. And sometimes you don't have to scrap the whole thing. You can simply make an adjustment on the fly. So I'm just going to counterbore a bigger hole. I'm going to hope that this still sets the same way and acknowledge that this really is just a locator rather than the mechanism that locks it in place, because I think the thing that locks it in place is going to attach on the front side. So let's make an adjustment and keep going. And just like that, we have a new iteration of this jig. So let's break this down very briefly. On the bottom, I have these 4 screw holes. Those attach to the same points that the base plate closes the blade. So this is absolutely flush to the bottom of this biscuit joiner. And then I have these 2 screw holes here, which attach this cradle. Now, I just stole this piece right off the old jig because luckily it happened to fit the same diameter of the handle of the DeWalt. So that worked out nicely. When those 2 screws are loose on top, I can move this in and out freely. When I lock it down, it's not going anywhere. So that's good to go. Now on the front, I basically have 2 screw holes here, which lock this plate to the front of the machine the same way the original fence locks to the front of the machine. And then I have these 2 screw holes down here, which lock these 2 components together. So this thing is square and attached to itself, independent of the machine. So there's a lot of attachment points going on here, which should allow us to have an accurate, repeatable jig. The base plate is super long so that I can drop it in a vise and not be worried about any of the cords or the bottom of the machine getting in the way. And this face plate is pretty oversized because unlike on the original pieces, when I was worried about the arched nature of these pieces and needed that faceplate to be shorter, the pieces that we're working with in this class are going to be flat, so I'm not worried about that. I can always cut it down in the future if I need a shorter table, but I'm gonna err on the side of caution and have a bigger table to work with. Now at this point, what needs to happen is we have to figure out how much this blade wants to protrude in order to get the appropriate width and depth of the arc for the staves of this cabinet. But in order to do that, I need poplar, and I don't have any on hand at the shop. So first, we need to make a field trip. Well, that's inconvenient.
But you know what's incredibly convenient? That the sponsor of this week's video is Wopes. Wopes makes the Mega 3, a portable battery power station powerful enough to run an entire wood shop. And if you don't believe me, watch this. The Wopes Mega 3 has over 3,000 watt hours of capacity, a 3,600 watt AC pure sine inverter, and can be fully recharged in 1 hour. Now, if none of that makes any sense to you, don't feel bad.
I also don't understand, but that's what the copy says, so I said it to sound smart.
What I do know is that this battery is seriously capable. The Mega 3 has 5 120 volt plugs, a 30 amp output port, along with USB, USB-C, and DC ports to boot. Whether you're using it to power up your machines on a job site or power your appliances when camping, its Life P04 battery can last up to 3,500 charges. And if you use your tools hard and need to power up while you work, you can use Wope's 240 watt folding solar panels to keep your battery running all day. That's what I'll be doing when I come out here to do some power carving soon.
So a big thanks to Wopes for sponsoring this video. If you want to learn more about Wopes and the Mega 3 Power Station, you can check the link in the description below. Well, now that that's out of the way, and we have some poplar to work with, let's start prototyping this cabinet. So here's the plan right now. I'm not going to build the entire cabinet because that's not what this video is about. That's going to take place later on down the road. But right now, I'm going to pull from my CAD drawings the dimensions of the staves for the doors. I'm going to mill up some of those blanks, and then we're going to play with the jig to see if we can get the effect that we want using the 4-inch blade from the biscuit joiner. So let's do that. All right, well, she works. She cuts a champ. She cuts a beautiful and accurate cove. And a couple of things I want to take note of before we talk about how to actually set this up and get the proper cut. Number one, you may have noticed that I moved it from my bench over to the work area on that side of the shop, and that was for two reasons. Number one, because we try to do most of our machining over there and use this area for hand tools, and this thing does put off quite a bit of dust. There's no dust collection on it. Perhaps a smarter person than I could create some kind of dust chute there, but I have neither the time nor the interest. So in an effort to spare my shop mates dust all over their lungs, just moved it over to the machine side of the room. But also, that gave me the opportunity to show you that this thing is portable because it's a jig, but also the value of these things, the hand screws. I use these things more than you think that I would. Maybe not so much at my joiner's bench, but when I'm on the go, when I'm working in different areas, I always take hand screws with me because they're so valuable in a setup like this. So if you don't have a joiner's bench, if you don't have a front vise, you can absolutely still get these workarounds going by simply having a couple of hand screws and clamping those to a work surface, be it hollow core door, melamine, whatever. You have kind of an automatic vise set up there, which is really nice. Now that said, on to the actual setup and cutting of this jig. I'm gonna take this out of the way just so it's not covering my face, but I will leave this here as though it's clamped in place. So here's how this setup works. It's very, very simple. The first thing you wanna do is find your center line on the opening for the slot. So you raise the blade up as high as it can go. That gives you the full width cut of the blade on your jig, and then you find the center line accordingly. From there, you can take the width of whatever piece you're trying to cut. In this case, it's 1 13/16, and you split the difference. So you get 1 13/16 on that center line. So for those of you who are worried about metric and conversions, I don't know what it is. I just eyeball it and then I just adjust left or right until it works. This is woodworking. This isn't engineering. It's gonna be fine. Once I have that set up, I have my initial fence set up half the distance away from the center line of the width of my material. Also, you know what? Another note on distance. You can just mark the center line of your piece and then push it up against there and do that. You don't even have to take any measurements. So, bah humbug to the metric folk among us. Now, once I have this fence set up, I can make a cut. My piece is rotating toward my fence, so any motion is going to pull it toward the fence, so I'm good to go. However, just to be safe, to make sure I don't do this and ruin my cove, I like to put a secondary fence here. Now, this piece doesn't have to have the same angle as my workpiece, but by doing so, by having a complementary angle, it's essentially locking the piece down, at least on this one side, so it can't move up because wedging. So I have this clamped down, and then I can move through the cut. In a perfect world, I would make this in a couple of passes. But it ain't a perfect world, and I often have deadlines to meet, so I make it a one pass and I just go nice and slow, easy breezy. I'm not worried about anything. I can always take more off if I need to move it up, so I err on the side of caution and have it go down. But that's all it is. You saw me take it in one pass, and listen, that's a good cove right there. That looks nice. Is it a perfect surface? Of course not. I'm cutting across the grain. There's always gonna be a lot of sanding to do no matter how you cove cut a thing. But that gives me a really nice, pretty eccentric cove right off a biscuit joiner. So if you don't have a table saw and you need to do some cuts, or the radius is too wide on a table saw, I mean, super easy. So one more thing I want to touch base on about setting up this cove and the width of the cove that you're cutting. If you're coming at 90 degrees to the blade, that's the widest your cove is ever going to be. And you can change the width of that cove by angling the approach to the blade. Just so you have some visual in your head, this blade is 1/8 of an inch thick. It's a standard blade. So this cove, the way this is set up to cut 1 13/16 at 90 degrees, can go anywhere from 1 13/16 to 1/8 of an inch, anywhere in between, while maintaining that same depth of cut. If I want this to be deeper, I can always raise the blade up, but then it makes the arc wider. So if I wanted to have a deeper cove, but still keep that 1 13/16, then I would just experiment with the angle until the angle of approach matches the 1 13/16. It sounds a little finicky. It is quite a bit finicky, but cove cutting is always an experimentation in approaches and angles and multiple passes to get it to the depth and width that you want until it looks right. So just something to be aware of. So friends, that is that, as they say. I hope this was helpful. I hope it was informational. This, I admit, is a super niche thing. So much so that I haven't even used it in 2+ years. So it's not something you're gonna break out every day, but when the time comes for that one project and you have that one right idea and the cove cutting on the table saw ain't quite cutting it because it's not giving you the arc that you want, don't forget about this bad boy. But also, more importantly than that, the point of this video is not about learning to cove cut with a biscuit joiner. It's about learning that your options are limitless if you are willing to think outside the box. I took this idea from Tom Keeley, who was one of my teachers and the man who I constantly blame for ruining my life with introducing me to all sorts of techniques, not the least of which power carving, but he also was the first person to introduce me to cove cutting with a biscuit joiner because it just worked for the application he needed it to. And so I took that and I applied it to the project I was working on in a different style, in a different way, and it worked exactly as I needed it to. So take from it what you will, but don't be limited by what we'll call traditional techniques. As long as you can think of a way to utilize the thing in relative safety, then it's the right answer. So that's all I got right now. I have a lot of prototyping to do before I go teach this class, so I'm gonna get out of here and go do that. Friends, don't forget to check out Patreon if you're interested. And don't forget to check out my new podcast with my friends Paul and Mary, because it's a delightful conversation about design, woodworking, and absolute nonsensory. So I'm gonna go do those things, go get in the shop and go make a thing, and try to enjoy it if you can. Until next week.